You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. It's Friday, the end of the week. And that's kind of a good thing. Saturday tends to be my only day off because we do a show on Sunday. And you'd think I would love doing these shows. And I do. But there's this thing that hovers out there. Maybe some of you experience it. There are things you love to do and you schedule it, and you're fantastically excited about it until it comes to the time of doing it. Then you're like, oh, I got to do that thing I got scheduled. Now, don't ever misinterpret that as I don't love doing this show. But interpret that as it's nice sometimes to have a day where I do nothing. And I will tell you this. Sometimes on Saturday, you found that I get on and I do a live stream, an impromptu thing. Because sometimes you sit around here and you go, I got a day off. I don't have to record. I don't have to go live. I don't have to do anything. And then you sit around, you kind of drum your fingers and you go, you know what? I'm going to go live because I got this thing I want to talk about. So it's Friday. It's the end of the week. Welcome to it. I hope the end of the week means something significant for you, like, I get a break now for the next couple of days. And so now like the converse, oh, by the way, you're listening to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. This is the Intrepid radio program, and it's right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com if you want to go hear the audio version of the show right from the network. Or you can come over to my YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast, the exciting video simulcast of my talking face. And the best part about, of course, the YouTube channel is the live chat room, which is going on right now with all your brother and sister Intrepids. And if you don't feel that you're part of that congregation yet, congregation, I use the word lightly, metaphorically, euphemistically, mockingly. If you're not part of our group yet and you want to come over and be an Intrepid, come on over, check it out. And we've had some new people coming in over the last couple of weeks, which is kind of nice, and checking it out and sticking around. So it's good to see you all there. And that's over, of course, at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. All right, come on over, join the chat room. Now, I was kind of talking about this need for a weekend, a need to have days where you don't do anything. And it kind of sucks when that happens in the middle of the week because everybody else everybody's working, everybody's doing their stuff, but the weekend comes and there's that feeling of I got a break and the whole world's taking a break with me. Is kind of the feeling of it. Unless you go to the store, or you go to the gas station, or you go to places like that and you notice everybody's working, especially during holiday season. And so now, like with my wife Rainey, it's a little different. She's got her massage work that she does, but that's usually when people are staying at the hotels, which is towards the weekends, more like Saturdays and Sundays, where she's doing stuff at the Water Street Inn and over in Stillwater, Minnesota. And by the way, Two Loons Massage, if you're looking at the video here, right there's their logo. I'm trying to see where my finger's going. Two Loons Massage, you can go check them out. They do have a website, but it's not built yet. So go over to Facebook and look up Two Loons Massage. That's two, the numeral 2, Loons Massage. And you'll find Rainey and her partner Kendra's site for doing massage work, especially if you're local to the Twin Cities. Now, they come to you, but if you live in Michigan, I don't think they're going to make it over there. So they come to you if you're within like a 30, 40-mile radius of Stillwater, Minnesota. And they can bring their tables and come to you. And so go check them out. But the weekend for her might mean sometimes more work. And now, of course, with this new governmental lockdown from the governor of Minnesota for COVID, everything's gone quiet again. And so the massages are fewer and farther between. So Rainey doesn't have to do as much of those. But that also means she's not earning any money while that happens. And so that's always a strain and a stressor. She'd rather be busy, I think, on those days than take a break. So for all of us, the only point I'm making is that this is the end of the week, and this is the time when we can kick back, hopefully, a little bit and enjoy things. I'm going to go to my Spark Courage box. We started doing that the other day. This is that little box that I picked up. I think this was probably, if I look at the barcode on this, yeah, this thing cost $13, $12.95 in the United States. And I think it was like $10.99, 11 pounds in Great Britain is what they've got on the back. But this little box of Spark Courage, it's called. And I like to look at it, it says down below, 50 Ways to Be Bold. And a couple of days ago, we started pulling these. It's got these fake matches inside this fake book, Spark Courage. And each one of those has something written on it, some kind of thing for the day. So let's go to the Spark Courage box and pull out a matchstick, and let's see what we've got. All right. Let's see what we've got here. Today's, you can't read it. I'll hold it up to the camera. See, you can't read it, but I'll read it for you. Today's says, advocate for yourself and ask for something you want. How do you be bold today? Advocate for something you want. How did that word that again? Advocate for yourself and ask for something you want. Be bold about that. How often do you find that you bake the pie for everybody else? And you go, look, I baked this pie from scratch. I spent my time, my sweat, and my blood and tears. If you cut yourself cutting the apples for it, but you bake the pie, you make it, you cut it up into slices, and you give everybody a slice. Eat the pie I've made. And then you realize you don't have a slice left for yourself. Many times we think that it's selfish to think about self. It's selfish to put ourselves first, to advocate for what our needs are. And I think that's a fallacy maybe in our society. Would that be societal or cultural? I think that's societal. We've grown to a place where if you ask for yourself, if you ask to be paid, if you ask for a raise at work, if you do a project and you ask for a little financial aid to help your gas to get there to help somebody out. And then look, I've focused on all work and financial stuff, but what are other ways that you can advocate for self? Things that you put, time that you put in, things about yourself. Hey, look, I'm here. I'm advocating for me. And I'm going to ask for something I need from you. And so it's okay to do that, because in our society, we've kind of downgraded that. Lately, it's selfish or it's improper to say I could use this or I need this. And of course, you've got the opposite. There's people out there that are always needing something. You know that person. You know who they are. I remember a church I went to many years ago now, but there was a young couple and they always had a problem. Now, it wasn't that they couldn't use help and that they had legitimate things going on. But there was always, if it wasn't a financial problem, it was a health problem or a this problem or that problem. It seemed that I could never approach them or talk to them where there wasn't a problem that needed solving and needed help. And, of course, we all have stuff. And so putting ourselves out to other people, that's what we do. We give of ourselves to people. We give of ourselves to our spouse. We give of ourselves to our children. Yesterday, here's a good example. Yesterday, we went and we had to go. I had to go pick something up, and I had to wait in line in my car. And so we're sitting there, and my 9-year-old Rowan Claire wanted to come along, and I said, "Sure, come on along." And she sat in the car, and we're sitting there, and while I'm sitting in line, I'm looking at my phone, and I'm looking at messages. And then I realized she's very quiet over there. And I looked over at her. She's got her knees up to her chin and her arms around her knees. And she's just sitting and kind of humming. And I said, "Hey, you wanted to come along." And I said, "And here we're both sitting here. I'm on my phone. And you're thinking about other things. Let's talk." And I put my phone away. And so we give of ourselves to the people we love and we care about. Because if we don't, sometimes we get too focused on self. But what about the opposite of that? The putting yourself out there and saying, I'm advocating for me. I'm advocating for, here are my needs. Here's what I would love to have. If that be something like, I don't know, you say to your spouse, I would love to have a hug today. Now, that sounds silly, but sometimes we go through life and we don't even realize. Have you ever gone through a day with your spouse and realized, we haven't touched each other today, meaning like a hug, or we haven't spoken yet today. We've had a cup of coffee, we said in the morning when we get up, but that's about it. And I always make a point when I walk by Rainey, I'll always touch her. Now, it isn't always a furtive grope. I'm not like going for boob or going for, grabbing pussy, as they say. It's not that I do that every time I walk by Rainey. There are occasions where that happens, and it's appropriate. But I like to walk by Rainey, and if I'm walking by her, I don't necessarily stop. I might put a finger on one shoulder and run it across to the other shoulder as I walk by. I need that touch. I like to have that. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. And no cough button here without turning my whole sound system down. So, do you go out of your way and say, this is what I need? I'm advocating for me today. I need a hug. And it's not, I need a hug. It's, I'm thinking of Donkey from Shrek. I'm thinking of, hey, I need 8 seconds of close, intimate time with you. Boom, big hug. All right, and I grab your butt in the process, or you grab mine in the process, or whatever. We all need those things, so there's that as well. So how do you advocate for what you need? And how do you advocate? And I want to take it out of the needs category a little bit. How do you advocate just for you? Hey, this is what I'd like today. And I'm going to advocate, and I'm going to speak up about it. And that's what that little matchstick told us. Speak up about what you want. Speak up about what you need. And it doesn't have to be selfish, but it's okay if it lies in a little bit of a selfish realm. Who cares? This is what I need today. This is what I would like today. I would like to hold your hand. I would like to go to a movie, if you can find an open theater. Sorry, I got a scratch back there today that I can't seem to get rid of. Here, let me take a little sip. And so, there you go. There's your spark courage today. Have courage to be bold today. Have courage to ask for what you need. Have courage to advocate for yourself. All right? Now let's move on into seeing if perhaps today we might be able to wrap up this whole thing on the nativity, on the virgin birth. Now, we've talked about the virgin birth before. We had a couple of days where we talked about it several months back. Now we've talked about this one all week. I think it's an interesting study, especially if you grew up in church or you grew up in a Christian setting or you have some of that in your background. And we're constantly flooded with this belief system that the virgin birth was something that actually happened. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say it didn't happen. I'm going to go far enough to say that if it did happen, it was something that happened because it was a divine act. It was divinity, and God stepped in and broke the laws of physics to make that happen. But as we're finding in this study, there were ways in ancient times that they understood that a virgin birth was almost a metaphoric thing that was placed in league with a physical father being there. So you've got in the story of the Nativity, it's only mentioned twice in the Bible, and it's by Matthew and Luke. The other two gospel writers don't mention it, and nobody else really mentions it. Though you have Paul in his writings talking about the pre-existent Christ, the glory of God that existed, and then that came on Christ, on Jesus as he grew older. You've got that study. But for the most part, you don't see the virgin birth as being something that's pushed in the Bible. And then you see books like Matthew, where he talks about prophetic verses in the Old Testament from the old prophets Isaiah and Hosea, talking about the coming virgin birth. And yet when you look at those passages, the context of those statements has nothing to do with a coming Messiah or a coming virgin birth. It had to do with the situation Israel was in at the time. And it's a metaphor for Israel, not a metaphor for a coming Messiah. So Matthew did what we see a lot of people do today. They'll pull a verse out of the scriptures that they know and they build their case. What does that do to the Gospel of Matthew for you? If you know that Matthew did that, that would be like, and I've mentioned it before, hearing guys like, for political sake, politicians' sake, for the sake of politics, there you go. We've seen people like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who talked at Christmas time about Mary and Joseph being homeless and poor, and that they should be taken care of, and then that's what we should do then for people. That's exactly what Matthew did with the virgin birth, because Joseph and Mary weren't poor people, nor were they homeless. They had to travel somewhere, according to the scripture, for a census, which we found out by Luke didn't take place for 10 years after Jesus would have been born. And that's historically speaking. So where did they merge all these facts together to get this story? But they went, and Mary was pregnant, and they needed a place to stay, and the inns were all full because of the census. And so it's not that they didn't have money. It's that they couldn't find a room. It's not that they were homeless. It's that they were traveling. It's not that they were poor or impoverished. Joseph was apparently, as we found out later in Jesus' life, a well-known carpenter and stonemason in Nazareth. He was a contractor. He'd be the guy that lives down the street from you with the pickup truck because he's a contractor, builds houses for a living. And so this is what Joseph was. So he was none of those things that the Reverend Jesse Jackson wanted to make him out to be for the sake of politics or the sake of, let's put good motives on him. He wanted to motivate people to give and help homeless people and hurting people and impoverished people at Christmas time. I get that. That's okay. But he had to misquote his scripture to try to make a scriptural story out of it. And this is what Matthew did. He went to prophecies that weren't prophecies at all. They were statements, metaphoric statements about Israel at the time and what they were going through from both Isaiah and Hosea. So all of that stuff is what I'm looking at when I'm trying to recap what we've been looking at. And the images that surround us today, the celebration of Christmas, they represent neither the earliest nor the only ways of expressing faith in Jesus. And this is what we ended on yesterday. The infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, from which we derive all these images of the nativity scene, the magi bringing their three gifts, so the camels are in the stall, and so are the sheep, and the cattle are lowing, the poor baby wakes, as the song says, at Christmas time. And and the sheep and the shepherds and so on, seeing the star in the night and the sky filled with the heavenly host of angels. These are images. We derive these images, and they differ in details between Matthew and Luke, where we get the information from. And when Christians view a nativity scene containing shepherds and magi, they're witnessing a harmonization of the stories of Matthew and Luke that are in some ways irreconcilable. And so you look at that, and by the way, for the Magi to have been there on the night of Jesus' birth, we used to look at this a long time ago, and I thought the Magi came because they saw the star from the east where they were from. They think Babylonia. and they saw the star in the sky on the night of Jesus' birth. And so they traveled to find him. The estimates are that it was probably a couple of years after the birth that they actually showed up. And they went to Herod first and said, "We saw this star that portends the birth of a king." And Herod, being very old and very jealous and very murderous about his throne, said, "When you find this guy, why don't you come back and tell me about him?" So they go and they find Jesus, and they bring the gifts. It doesn't say they were at the manger in the stable. It says that they visited the boy and his family. And then the angel, I think it was the angel that told them they have to go back another way. No, don't go back to Herod. He just wants to kill him. Then, of course, we know what Herod did after that. And then the flight to Egypt. I think Jesus may have been about 2 years old at that time. But, so all of this stuff that we look at, that's the traditional imagery in our minds, some of us say, it's okay. I still like it. Well, I do too. I like Christmas. I like Christmas songs. I like nativity scenes. But I also like facts. I like to know things. I like to know why I believe something. And if I find that those facts historically are different than what I've been taught in a traditional sense, I want to know those things too. And that's why we talk about this stuff. And that's why we're going to continue in the second half to hopefully wrap this up, because I see I've almost used up all my time in the first half of this. But this is important stuff for understanding why you believe what you believe, and understanding what you believe and how you should believe as a result of that. It's not trying to steal away anything. It's trying to say, all this is doing is saying that if Jesus is the Son of God, perhaps he did not, it's an acquired thing that he has. It's something that came on him as an act of obedience, something that came on him because it was that pre-existent Christ that all of a sudden, because of resurrection, because of these things, that this happened. Now, you can down-talk the resurrection as well. We don't know for sure. We don't know that any of this is real. We accept by faith that it is a real thing. And so I'm not bringing this stuff up because I'm trying to bolster your faith or tear down your faith. I just think it's an interesting study about the things of faith. So we'll get into this a little bit more when we come back after this break, and hopefully try to wrap up this whole idea, this whole thing about Mary being a virgin and Jesus being the Son of God. And some try to link those things, but I don't think they're necessarily linkable. All right? So the two great accounts agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem during the reign of Herod the Great, and that his mother's name was Mary, and that she was betrothed to Joseph, that an angel announced the birth in advance and instructed that the child was to be named Jesus, and that the Holy Spirit caused Mary to
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, welcome back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. And at the same time, come on over and see my video simulcast of this show over on my YouTube channel and join the live chat room that's going on there right now during this show. That's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we were talking about this. Now, I always start that way. I wish I had a different way. I've got to train myself to have a different way to say that. Now, we were talking about in the first half. So, let's pick up where we left off from the first segment. And we're talking about this whole thing of the virgin birth. We're talking about, is there efficacy to the story of the virgin birth? Or is the virgin birth something that we might not have thought it was? Is it something that was added later? Is it something that was more descriptive of what God was doing as opposed to what God physically did? So we just, at the end of the first segment, we went through all those things that we already know. Herod the Great was reigning on the throne in Israel. He was a puppet king, of course, to Rome. Excuse me. All the accounts between Matthew and Luke, they agree on these things, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that Herod the Great was on the throne, that Jesus' mother's name was Mary, that she was betrothed to Joseph, and that the angel announced that birth in advance and instructed that the child was to be named Jesus, and that the Holy Spirit caused Mary to conceive. They also probably agree that Mary was a virgin when she conceived, meaning she hadn't had sex before. And although some scholars suggest that Luke is not clear on this point, and unlike Matthew, Luke makes no explicit statement that Mary did not have sexual relations with Joseph after the Annunciation. Joseph A. Fitzmyer argues, for example, when this account is read in and for itself, without the overtones of the Matthew Annunciation to Joseph, every detail of it could have been understood to be of a child that was being born to Mary in the usual human way. And we brought up that quote when we were looking at a different aspect of this the other day. And so Joseph, beyond the basic elements that Matthew and Luke tell widely diverging stories, in Matthew, Joseph is the central character. The supporting cast consists of Herod, the Magi who come to visit, and the slaughtered children, because Herod sends out a decree that all boys 5 and under, I think it was, would be slaughtered, because he didn't want anybody usurping his throne. And in Luke, Mary is the dominant figure, and it's the yet-to-be-born John the Baptist, the shepherds, Simeon and Anna, who praise the child. And so Luke and Matthew differ in geography as well. But before we do that, I want to look at Joseph for a second. There was this song, and it was written by Michael Card, who is a Christian songwriter. And I always liked his work, 20 and 30 years ago, because he studied. He was an intellectual, a Christian intellectual, a Christian apologist, and he studied before he wrote his songs. If you've heard old songs, old Christian songs, remember Amy Grant? We don't hear much from her these days, but she went from Christian music to pop music a long time ago. But when she was doing her Christian music, early on, her Christian pop music, if you will, she did a few songs that were written by Michael Card. One of them was, if you remember the song, El Shaddai, El Shaddai, El Shaddai, El Elyon Adonai. Age to age, you're still the same by the power of the name El Shaddai, El Shaddai. And that's the song she did. And she was very popular for that one before she made her crossover. But Michael Card wrote that song. And he wrote this one about Joseph. And I did this in church once. And I really enjoyed this song. I played it on the guitar and did it in church. It's a very solemn song where Joseph is asking. Now think of this in the terms of Joseph. How could it be, this baby in my arms, sleeping now so peacefully? Here he says, how could it be, this baby in my arms, sleeping now so peacefully? The Son of God, the angels said, how could it be? Now, Michael Card takes it to the virgin birth part with Joseph. Lord, I know he's not my own, not of my flesh, not of my bone, but still, Father, let this baby be the son of my love, he says. And the chorus says, Father, show me where I fit into this plan of yours. How can a man be father to the Son of God? Lord, for all my life I've been a simple carpenter. How can I raise a king? How can I raise a king? That's how that goes. And even the emotion of that even bears me up from the times when I sang that. But when I study that, did Joseph know the child was his, or was it true that the child wasn't his, that it was God's? He goes on in the song and says, he looks so small, his face and hands so fair, and when he cries, the sun just seems to disappear, but when he laughs, it shines again. How could it be? Now, that's, of course, very fanciful. It's poetic. And then that chorus comes again. Father, show me where I fit into this plan of yours. How can a man be father to the Son of God? Lord, for all my life I've been a simple carpenter. How can I raise a king? How can I raise a king? Now, that's a story from faith. Your faith tells you that Joseph knew that he wasn't this child's father. But the fly in the ointment is, do we know from historical text that this is what this passage is saying? As emotional as it is, and as much as we put our faith in that, do we know that this is what was? This is where I still put in the caveat, because I say on an intellectual basis, we can look at these passages and say, look, it's saying something different. But there is that possibility that on the faith realm, the spiritual realm, that God did this. And if God, the very God, the creator, the originator of the universe, did this, then how could anybody reject it? There's the big question. If God really did this, then we're without excuse before him if we reject it. But we don't know that God did it. And we know from other writings of the day that this is how they treated heroic figures, great figures in history, especially in that region. They had everybody knew they were born of father and mother. But they became children of God, or sons of God, because of their obedience to him, because of the pre-existence of them. And so that's the big question that we're left with. There's no real answers. You can see the answer in the black and white, but that's just one side of the question. That's the intellectual side. Did this really happen? Luke and Matthew not only differ on some of these things, but they also differ in geography. Luke relates that Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, that they traveled to Bethlehem in connection with the census, and that the infant was placed in a manger, and that after he was circumcised and presented in the temple in Jerusalem, that the family returned directly to Nazareth. Yet an unbiased reader of Matthew would understand that Mary and Joseph lived in Bethlehem, that Jesus was born to Joseph's house, and that the family fled to Egypt to escape Herod's threat, and from there they returned to a new home in Nazareth. Now that's because of the way Matthew writes his gospel. Luke is the one that tells us they traveled to Bethlehem for the census, because that's where Joseph's family was from. Matthew tells us that they were from Bethlehem. So while Luke agrees with Matthew that Jesus was born after the death of Herod the Great, he connects the event of the birth with a Roman census taken when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. But Quirinius didn't become the governor until 6 A.D., and that was 10 years after Herod's death. We covered that a bit the other day. Now, if Luke is agreeing with Matthew that Jesus was born before the death of Herod the Great, that makes sense because both stories talk about King Herod and his reaction to learning about this birth. So Luke's statement fits in with his theological purpose for placing his gospel story in the context of secular history, the census of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. But it was on the date of the birth of Jesus that he's in error, because Jesus wasn't born during that time, 6 A.D. He was born at least 10 years earlier, because Herod the Great was still alive. So Luke messed up his dates. Now, both Matthew and Luke, by the way, was a physician. He was a trained, learned, educated, intelligent man. And he was also a historian. He wrote the book of Acts. Look at the book of Acts. So both Matthew and Luke offer these lists of Jesus' ancestors, although Luke places his genealogy outside the infancy narratives. Yet differences between the two lists are irreconcilable. Luke offers 77 names, compared with Matthew's 41, in the genealogies. And more serious is that the names differ from more often than not. And the two authors can't even agree on the name of Jesus' grandfather. Remember where we talked about that the other day? But both Matthew and Luke share a common problem. They want to link Jesus to David, the king, from the 9th century or 10th century BCE, in order to demonstrate that he is the Davidic Messiah, as expected by some of their Jewish contemporaries. Their genealogical lists trace Jesus' ancestry through Joseph, who's shown to descend from David, the king, even though they don't regard Joseph as the natural father of Jesus. Yet they found it was very important to link Jesus to Joseph and to David. Luke 1:36 states that Mary was related to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was of the tribe of Levi, and thus not descended from David. Luke solves this problem by editorializing that Jesus was thought to be the son of Joseph, who, according to both genealogies, was of Davidic descent. Matthew follows his genealogy with a story in which Joseph is instructed to take Mary into his house. Joseph did as the Lord's angel commanded him. He took his wife, but he did not know her until she bore a son. He didn't have sex with her, in other words, until she bore this son. And so, in effect, Joseph adopted Jesus as his son, and by adoption made Jesus a descendant of David, not by blood. So both Matthew and Luke appear to have brought together sources with differing points of view. In Luke 1, for example, the angel announces to Mary that she's to give birth to the Son of God. Yet all of the stories in the next chapter take place as if that Annunciation had never happened. Mary wonders about the meaning of the visit of the shepherds, and she and Joseph are surprised when Simeon says of Jesus that he's the light for a revelation to the nations and a glory to your people Israel. What? That's my kid, is that? She asks. They're also puzzled by the behavior of the 12-year-old Jesus who sits in the temple and debates theology with the experts. That's in Luke 2. None of these events should have surprised someone who had an angelic prediction in Luke 1 that seems to have gotten the material in chapter 2 from a tradition that knew nothing of Mary's own knowledge of her miraculous conception. So on one hand, she's got an angel of God visiting her, saying, God's going to impregnate you. This is the Messiah, the long sought-after kinsman redeemer. You'll name him Jesus because he's going to save his people from their sins. And yet, as he's growing up, she doesn't seem to have any clue as to why he's special. What makes him special? And so the accounts confuse it. So most scholars are in agreement that, well, let's back that up. Luke prefaces his whole account of Jesus with a story of the Annunciation and the birth of John the Baptist. This is Elizabeth, who we talked about earlier, was his mother. And it has no specifically Christian content to it. And most of the scholars agree that Luke incorporated into this narrative story, which originated among the followers of John the Baptist, that Luke threw this into Jesus' story. Luke simply adapted this material to his theological perspective that Jesus was superior to his predecessor, John the Baptist. John was the voice crying in the wilderness, announcing the coming Messiah, and Jesus was the Messiah. So for both Matthew and Luke, the Old Testament was a valuable, even sacred source. Both gospel writers employ the familiar images of the Hebrew scriptures that create the nativity stories and important points in Luke's narrative. The characters break into songs that are based on the Old Testament. The Magnificat of Mary, the Benedictus of Elizabeth's husband Zechariah, and the Nunc Dimittis of Simeon. All are poems that breathe the air of the old Jewish piety. And parallels with the Old Testament and other Jewish literature are numerous. And we note a few examples. Mary begins her Magnificat with the words, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit exults in God my Savior." That's Luke 1:46. And among Old Testament parallels are Psalm 35. "Then my soul shall find gladness in the Lord, and rejoice in his deliverance." And in Habakkuk, "I will rejoice in the..." That's a book of the Bible you don't hear about very much. Tiny little book. "I will rejoice in the Lord and exult in the God of my salvation." And so the opening words of the Benedictus, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel." That's in Luke 1. And those are the closing words of the 3 of the Old Testament Psalms. And when Zechariah, Elizabeth's husband, sings of the salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us in Luke 1, he's repeating another motif for the Psalms. Psalm 18, "He delivered me from my strong enemies and from those who hate me." In the Nunc Dimittis, in Luke 2:29-32, the themes of seeing salvation, the sight of all peoples, a light to the Gentiles, and the glory for Israel echo motifs that go back as far as 2nd Isaiah. And the Lord has revealed his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation that comes from our God. That's Isaiah 52. "I will give you as a light to the nations," Isaiah 49. "I will give to Israel my glory," that's Isaiah 46. So while it's possible that Luke composed these hymns himself, it's more likely that he lightly edited Jewish or Jewish Christian poems and worked them into his text. The Old Testament provides these motifs for a number of details in these stories between Matthew and Luke. The annunciations to Zechariah, the husband of Elizabeth, and to Mary and to Joseph. They follow the pattern for angelic visitations in the Old Testament before the births of Ishmael in Genesis 16, Isaac in Genesis 17, Samson in Judges 13. And in all 5 cases, Jesus in Matthew and Luke, Ishmael, Isaac, and Samson. We find many elements from the following pattern consisting of 5 steps. They go like this. 1, the appearance of an angel or of God. 2, fear or prostration of the person having the vision. They fall on their face before the angel. 3, the divine message is given. And there's a bunch of stuff under that. The person having the vision is addressed by name. A qualifying phrase describes the person who's having the vision. The person having the vision is urged to not be afraid. The divine messenger says that the woman is with child or is about to have a child. The divine messenger says the woman will give birth to the child. The divine messenger gives the name by which the child is to be called. An etymology is provided, interpreting the name. The future accomplishments of the child are predicted, and the person having are predicted. And then the 4th, now that was all under number 3. Number 4, the person having the vision objects. How can this be? Or a sign is requested. Give me some sign. And number 5, a sign reassures the person that's having the vision. So this is those are the elements that follow this Old Testament pattern of the angel of the Lord appearing and talking about a child that's going to be born. So in addition, Luke's narrative draws on the account of the birth of Samuel. And you can find that account of Samuel in the book of Samuel. John the Baptist was to drink no wine. And that's reminiscent of the Nazirite vows promised for Samson and Samuel in Judges 13 and 1 Samuel 9. Mary's Magnificat, Luke 1, echoes the song of Samuel's mother Hannah in 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. Mary brings Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem in Luke 2, as Hannah brought Samuel to the tabernacle in Shiloh. In 1 Samuel 1, in the sacred precincts, Mary encounters the aged Simeon, much as Hannah had encountered the old priest Eli. So there's these similarities in the story. And in some cases, Luke seems to have adapted his narrative language from these Old Testament stories. He introduces Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth in Luke 1:5. And it's the same formula that begins the story in 1 Samuel. Parallel to are the descriptions of the return home of Zechariah, Elkanah, and Hannah, and the conception of John the Baptist and Samuel, and the response of Elizabeth and Hannah in Luke 1 and 1 Samuel 1. Mary's response in Luke 1 is too much like that of Hannah's in 1 Samuel 1:18 to be coincidental. Mary said, "Behold the Lord's handmaid, let it happen to me according to your word." Hannah said in the Old Testament at the birth of Samuel, "Let your handmaid receive favor in your eyes." So similarly, Luke draws on Judges 13, the story of Samuel, 1 Samuel 2, the story of Samuel, and in composing his summary statements about the growth of John the Baptist in Luke 1:80, and of Jesus in Luke 2. So you see all these similarities. It sounds a little complex when we start breaking it all down, but this is where Luke drew his material from. Now, by faith, you could say they were different stories. He's obviously just telling his story, and it really sounds like the same thing, or it is the same thing. Matthew also made use of the Old Testament. He adapted the stories of Balaam, Joseph, and Moses. Balaam, remember, he was the seer from the east who predicted that a star would rise over Israel. He's the one who also had the talking donkey, if you remember that. That was Numbers 22. And in the Septuagint, the version of Numbers 24, Balaam predicts that a star will arise from Jacob, Jacob being Israel, and a man will stand forth from Israel. That Balaam was a Gentile, and according to the Philo of Alexandria, a magus, or a wise man. That makes him a prototype for Matthew's Magi. And so you see that similarity there. Other motifs in Matthew come from the Old Testament stories of Joseph and Moses. When Joseph, the husband of Mary, dreams dreams and goes to Egypt, he repeats the behavior of Joseph, the patriarch, in Genesis 37. And the story of the wicked Herod, who attempts to kill Jesus and slaughter the male children at Bethlehem, is Matthew's adaptation of the Old Testament story of the Pharaoh, who massacred the male children of the Israelites in Exodus. So the modern reader can get pretty frustrated by these observations about the diverse sources of the gospel nativity stories. And they seem not to meet the needs of the religious piety nor to satisfy the historian's curiosity about what really happened. But they open us to new possibilities of understanding Matthew and Luke as creative literary figures, as theologians who used the materials at their disposal in the service of a message about God's presence in the world. Their genealogies differ, for example, because they perform different functions. Matthew's genealogy makes the theological affirmation that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. Matthew 1 identifies Jesus as son of David, son of Abraham, that is, as the Davidic Messiah and a Jew, in his structuring of the genealogy into these three groups of 14 generations each: Abraham to David, David to the exile in Babylonia, and the exile up to Joseph the carpenter, the husband of Mary. So Matthew makes David the point of transition between the first two sections. And lest the reader miss the point, Matthew calls Joseph son of David. So, Joseph the carpenter. So Luke's intention, on the other hand, is to show that Jesus is the Son of God. He places his genealogy after the baptism of Jesus, which concludes with the divine proclamation of Jesus' sonship. That's in Luke 3. And then Luke historizes the title Son of God by tracing Jesus' ancestry back to God through Adam. That's in Luke 3. Jesus is a son of God, not by adoption or pre-existence, but by genealogical descent, which, frankly, we all are the same thing, if we all hail back to Adam, who came from God. That's how Luke justifies that. But both Matthew and Luke grasped instinctively that theological truth is best communicated by telling a story. They reflected the religious views and used the literary tools of their own day, but they challenged their readers to experience truth by participating in a story rather than by reciting a creed or affirming a dogma. Matthew and Luke also avoided the pious excesses of succeeding generations, which describe the childhood of Jesus in grotesque fantasies. The apocryphal stories in the Infancy gospel attributed to Thomas of a petulant Jesus who, as a child, used miraculous powers to perform magic, to bring doves back to life and things like that. Or to punish, he does this to perform magic or to punish people who displeased him and are far removed from the simple narratives of the canonical Gospels. So these two evangelists used different literary techniques. And you know what? We still haven't gotten through all the material that is here. So we may or may not hit this up again, but I hope you get a pretty good idea of what we've got about the virgin birth of Jesus. The conclusion being it was probably a literary invention, and that Joseph is probably the father, and that God is also the Father by way of emphasizing that God was the impregnator of Mary. And there's also that whole idea that Jesus was pre-existent prior to all of creation. So there you go, folks. Hope it hasn't left you confused. Happy Friday evening. We'll see you here Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time for It's Sunday with Rainey and me. And we'll probably hit this topic one more time on Monday. So you guys have a great weekend and a great night.